close to my hometown, Jersey in the Channel Islands. Liverpool, London.
It's just taking its minute to
Minnesota.
join.
Hey, Brian.
Mm.
We've got a couple of other people who are in the book, in the audience, I think.
Oh,
Okay, we
Yeah.
are now live streaming, so we're good to go.
Okay, we had better get going. I think we'll still have people coming in for a little bit, but welcome to this book launch for Realms of Imagination, Essay from the Wide Worlds of Fantasy, which accompanies the exhibition that opened at the British Library on the 28th of October and runs to February 25th. Tanya and I were both curators on this exhibition. Tanya, do you want to say a little bit about the exhibition? And we'll come to the book and to our fabulous contributors.
Yes, yeah, we're really proud of the exhibition. So yeah, as Matt said, opened right at the end of October. And what we wanted to do with the exhibition was to take a really, really broad look at fantasy and where its kind of historical roots came from. So wanted to get as many different formats of fantasy. So not just books and manuscripts, but also showing what incredibly multimedia genre it's become. So we've got representations of different forms of gaming, including video games, board games, card games, live action role play. We've got film, TV, clips, props, costumes, artwork, music, all in there. And quite a lot about fan culture as well, and how fans have a kind of a transformative impact, and how important fantasy is to kind of fandom communities. We trace the history of fantasy right back to some of the oldest forms of storytelling. So the exhibition's kind of structured around different types of story that kind of lend things to fantasy. So we start with fairy tales and folk tales, and then move through to epics and quests. Those are the two sections that talk about kind of these oldest forms of storytelling, and how fantasy is kind of constantly reweaving threads from these older genres, the kind of often oral traditions and things like that, into new transformative works. And then we move into weird and uncanny, which is a kind of uncomfortable, darker side of fantasy. And the final section looks at the history of world building, and kind of concludes with the world of fandom. So that's a really whistle-stop tour. And then Matt, maybe you could say something about I'll just say beforehand, so some of the great, we have some amazing treasures in the exhibition from the library's collections, but we've, so including things like the original, or the surviving manuscript of Beowulf, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, some amazing medieval collection items. We've got material from Angela Carter's archive, the Mervyn Peake archive, the original manuscript of Alice's Adventures Underground, which became Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So many other things, but we've also had amazing loans. So we're really lucky that we've got material from the Ursula K. Le Guin archive from the University of Oregon. That's on display for the first time in the UK, and it's been really, really amazing to see what an emotional reaction a lot of people have had to that manuscript material. So it's the notebook of the Wizard of Earthsea and two of her kind of drawings that she did for herself from Tombs of Atuan. People have really reacted really emotionally and personally to seeing these, so that's been really lovely. We've heard so many gasps in the gallery. We've also had loans from Neil Gaiman, who's lent us his notebook for Coraline. There's loads of amazing costumes, including great material from The Dark Crystal, the 1982 film that's on loan from Brian and Wendy Froud. So much great stuff. Yeah, please come. And Matt, do you want to start talking a bit about the book and how we structured that?
Yeah, I think the book is a companion volume to the exhibition rather than a catalogue. So it includes things that are in the exhibition, but there are things that are in the exhibition that are not in the book, and there are things in the book that are not in the exhibition, including fabulous essays by the people we have here today on the webinar, fabulous essays by people we have who are attending this tonight, and even some people who are not here, but we will credit. One of the reasons we wanted to start by talking about the exhibition is because the exhibition and the book share a structure. So they're structured running through fairy and folk tales, epics and quests, the weird and the uncanny, and then portals and worlds. We will be structuring the first part of this discussion in the same way. We'll be talking through those 4 sections. We have someone who wrote one of the longer essays in each section here today. So Cristina Bacchilega wrote a long essay for books and fairy tales, Sofia Samatar for Epics and Quest, and VanderMeer for the Weird and Uncanny, and Dimitra Fimi for Portals and Worlds. And we will introduce people, I guess as we go around. But welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us. Fairy and folk tales. I feel slightly guilty that Terry is here. Terry is the other long essayist. She has been doing an awful lot of work for the British Library exhibition, so we thought we could not prevail on her for yet another panel. But the essays in the folk and fairy tale section, Cristina and Terry wrote 2 wonderful long essays for that section. There's also a shorter essay by a colleague, a colleague at the British Library, Rachel Foss, who wrote about Neil Gaiman's On Fairy Stories. I'm just frantically flipping through the book to remind myself exactly what is going on. This has been a longer week. Greg Burswell wrote about the Angela Carter Archive, which is also in the exhibition. And Marina Warner wrote us a lovely essay about fairy tales in performance. Cristina Bacchilega, who is Professor Emerita of English at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, the co-editor of Marvels and Tales, the author of a number of really important books on fairy tales and wonder tales more broadly, wrote us a brilliant essay on the sort of world tradition of fairy and folk stories, which she's going to talk about now. Christine, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt and Tanya and Dimitra for organizing this webinar, but also for this book is amazing. It is just great. And I don't say it because I'm in it, but because it's just wonderful. I hope that the exhibition will make its way to other continents so that I can see it as well. Yes, I was asked to write about and talk about fairy tales and wonder tales of the world. And oh my, what a task. We all know what a fairy tale is when we encounter one, but there are so many kinds of fairy tales. And not all fairy tales are called fairy tales. We often refer to them as tales of magic, as wonder tales. They're just infinitely various. I would fortunately, Terry Windling wrote an essay for this book that is about stories about fairies, because that is one kind of fairy story that I learned a lot about from reading her essay. Thank you, Terry. Okay, so I decided when writing this essay to turn the challenge of defining the genre into a discussion of how fairy tale affordances, meaning what fairy tales do, articulate with the genre's history in relation to folk tales and the world's wonder tales more generally. And I'm hoping that doing that helps us get to some generative possibilities for fairy tales as they are created and adapted today. So we need to think about the genre historically, but also in the present as it is transforming in the present. So this got me started thinking about fairy tales as stories that take us into otherwise worlds, otherwise than the world of things as they are. I'm thinking of fairy tales, also stories that activate otherwise thinking. So I discuss in the essay stories of recognition, stories of transformation, and stories of wonder. Now, this is not all that fairy tales do, but all of these 3 affordances give us a glimpse of worlds that function otherwise, and where we as humans can be and act otherwise. So just want you to notice that I'm focusing on a future-facing aspect of these tales, rather than thinking about once upon a time as a kind of nostalgic a vision of the past. I'm thinking of it as a portal really into alternative worlds. So fairy tales, as I talk about them in the essay, are otherwise stories in at least three ways. They're gratifying stories in which unpromising heroines and heroes receive recognition. So these otherwise stories project us moving into ourselves as other than what we appear to be, achieving our fulfillment despite those who are not wise to our worth. Upholding recognition of who we are, this version of the fairy tale feels like slipping into the perfect fit of Cinderella's tiny shoe. We recognize ourselves in her as a worthy heroine. They are stories that activate transformation in their characters and in us as creators, audiences, adapters. As opposed to revealing the true self, these otherwise stories project us moving through other or different selves from the one that we've been assigned, finding ourselves newly wise to our own potential. Activating transformation, this version of the fairy tale empowers us to believe we too, like Cinderella, can break out of oppressive situations and refashion ourselves. And they're tales of wonder that unabashedly represent a world where everything is animate and where interaction of humans, non-humans, and spirits is normal, matter of course. These otherwise stories project us being and acting in another world where multiple dimensions coexist, and we find ourselves wise again to human and non-human interdependency. Steeped in this logic where the supernatural is natural, this version of the fairy tale asserts that it's possible for us to, like Cinderella in various versions, to reach for ancestral support and comprehend the language of birds and trees. So what I'm seeing is recognition, transformation, magic. I haven't talked about magic, magic and wonder, mixing and matching in fairy tales. And there's a lot of repetition, as you know, in fairy tales, and a lot of variation. But, and this is where I'm coming to the history, the dynamics of recognition and transformation, magic and wonder vary across time and space and are very much localized. And that's what I want to be looking at now. Matt, how am I doing with time?
You're great. Yeah, but yeah, I think you've been doing it for 4 or 5 minutes.
I have a little more time. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we often just think about fairy tales as, you know, the Disney stories, right? That's it. They've kind of flooded the imagination. But fairy tales have a history, and actually, I would say history is in the plural. The term fairy tale as conte de fées came about in the late 17th century in France, coined by Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy. But there are stories that we can associate with fairy tale that are much, much older. The story of the two brothers, for instance, is preserved in a 3,000-year-old papyrus. There's a Greek tale from the 1st century BC where we have a Cinderella shoe test, excuse me. And the plot really of Cinderella is activated in a 9th century Chinese tale that we found in manuscript. So fairy tales existed before the fairy tale. And most importantly, they're not really just European or Euro-American, as we have come to assume they are. Cinderella in Disney and in so many other representations is of course white and often blonde. And you know, we saw what kind of backlash there was when the idea of a Black Ariel came about in Disney, right? So we assume that there is a Euro-American core to fairy tales, but that's not the case. And it's very important to think about wonder tales that are not originating in Europe or in North America, and also maybe to start thinking about fairy tales as one of the wonder genres in the world. I'll just close by saying that thinking about this relationship between the wonder tales of the world and the fairy tale that we have kind of Eurocentrized and that a genre that has kind of assimilated other wonder genres. Thinking about this relationship raises questions of justice. And I want to say that in the fairy tale itself raises questions of justice. Okay, by making it possible to dream of a world where justice is the norm or is actually happening. Fairy tale endings are appealing because in them things happen the way we feel that they should. And so thinking about fairy tales as dreams of justice, and also thinking about how we can do justice to other wonder tales in the world is part of what I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christine. As it certainly does that. I hope that's whetted your appetite if you've not had the chance to. One of the main pleasures of working on this book for Tanya and me was like when each new essay would come in and we would sort of read it and go, wow, it really was just a joy whenever a new essay would appear. So moving on from fairy and folk tales to epics and quests, we had a sort of really distinguished set of contributors for this section. Well, it's true of all the sections, I think. For the shorter essays, we have Maria Devana Headley writing about Beowulf, and particularly about her process of translating or retelling that story. Our colleague Susan Reed, who curated the Epics and Quest section, led the curation of the Epics and Quest section of the exhibition, wrote about fantasies of King Arthur. And Brian Atterbury, who is here, I think, wrote a wonderful essay about the Wizards and Dragons of Earthsea, thinking about Earthsea Le Guin. The sort of two longer essays in that section, the two essays, one on each of the sort of title parts, so one on quests and one on epics. So our colleague at the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, Rob Masden, wrote an essay on quest fantasy. And we asked Sofia Samatar to write an essay for us on epic fantasy. Sofia Samatar will be known to you as the author of The Wonderful Stranger in Londria and The Winged History, so someone who has really engaged with the fantasies of scale and the attraction of those fantasies and their sort of, and who gets left out of those stories usually, and how they can be brought in. Also a scholar, of course, of African and Middle Eastern fantasies, and soon to be published science fiction author with The Practice, The Horizon, and The Chain coming out next October. So just a wonderful writer, someone we were really delighted to have write this, and wrote a wonderful essay called The Everything Book, which is happy to talk about. Thank you, Sofia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. I, like Cristina, need to start out with a huge thank you to Tanya and Matt and everyone who has worked on this gorgeous book, which, I mean, it's so beautiful. It's so full of images. Every page almost has something gorgeous on it. And in reading through, starting to read through these essays, I haven't finished the book, but I'm having an experience, a reading experience I haven't had before, which is equally intellectual and magical. So it's this feeling of being engaged with all of these fascinating ideas from all of these scholars. And at the same time, it feels like being immersed, with all of these beautiful images. It feels like being immersed in a fantasy world. So I really have read nothing like it before, and I'm so excited to be part of it. So my task, like Christina's, was on the large side. I was asked to write about modern epic fantasy in the context of the global epic tradition, which is basically write about all of narrative from, since the dawn of time until was basically that was the brief. And so, similar to Cristina, who had this way of breaking things down and separating it into categories, I also decided to do that. And what I did was select 5, I referred to them as dynamics more than elements, which sounds like elements of style or something, but 5 sort of energies, dynamic energies or processes that I see operating in both a very ancient epic tradition and modern epic fantasy. So I will just say a little something about each of those 5 things. And to make it even easier for myself, easier to sort of conceptualize, I related each of these dynamics to a sort of symbol. Each one of them has a symbol that goes with it. So the first one is discovery. And the symbol that I use there is the map. Of course, many fantasies, modern epic fantasies, have maps in them. My own 2 novels in that tradition have maps. But what the map sort of calls up or evokes is a sense of travel, which is often part of both, ancient and contemporary, ancient epics and contemporary ancient epic fantasies, and also an idea of exploration, which has a colonial kind of aura or shadow around it, this idea of exploration. So the map is at the same time the adventure, the going to another world, the entering through the door, going through the portal into a different space, maybe a space of wonder, maybe a space of terror, a land of the dead. It's all of that. And it's also sort of starting to move into this idea of conquest. In my second symbol, or my second dynamic, the second one is reduction. And my symbol there is the chessboard. And this is where it really becomes, this is that aspect of the larger and the narrower tradition that are about control and really about conquest. That's, what the chessboard is about. There are 2 sides. If you don't have conflict, you don't have any game. So it's kind of, it's like baked into the DNA of the thing to have conflict and to have the idea of knocking out the other side and possessing territory. Of course, many epics in the ancient tradition are for precisely that purpose. They are establishing the right to a territory. That's what the story is about. So that was my second thing. And by that time, I was sort of like, because I write these, right? So I'm thinking, ooh, this is sort of disturbing and unfortunate. And, what does it mean for me to be writing in this sort of tradition? But I continued. My third dynamic is combination. And my symbol there is cards. So I look at tarot cards, but really any set of cards to me, I use this image to evoke the sense of expansion in both older and contemporary epic stories, the feeling of something that is episodic, right? So if you take out those cards, each card, you can keep laying down another card, and each card is going to change everything that came before it. It's going to change the whole narrative, and yet you can also break them apart and separate them. So it gives a sense of expansiveness and breadth to a fantasy world to have that episodic shape, just like earlier epics. And we know this in contemporary literature as the series, right? And so many contemporary epic fantasies have the series. There's a whole bunch of books, which shows us that as much as this dynamic gives us the pleasure of expansion and feeling like we're playing around in a world that is sort of endless and you could always add another, there could always be another addition to the series. It's a real sense of breadth. There's also the pleasure of collection, when you get to feel like, oh, I have all the volumes of this, or or they come out with the box set. I love a box set myself personally, where you also have that feeling of sort of holding this world, this expansive world in your arms. Number 4 is compression. And my symbol here is the talisman. The prominent sort of granddaddy of those being the One Ring of the Lord of the Rings. One ring to rule them all, right? There's one thing that we need to get. So it's interesting, and I found it very interesting that along with, and probably necessary, that along with all of this massive expansion of epic narratives, there's a need at the same time to kind of compress and consolidate things so we can be like, what are we supposed to be looking at in all this stuff? Well, here it is. Here's this one thing we need to get. Here is this one character that we're following. Here is the most important, usually guy. Here's the hero of the story. So that is this sort of sense of compression, of pressing everything into someone who is the exemplary character that we're following, and something that is sort of the one thing that is the goal of the quest. Now, number 5, my 5th and final dynamic, is really the opposite of that. It is digression, because digression is also an enormous part of these narratives, both old and new. And my symbol for digression is the lyre, a musical instrument, because very often the digressions in these narratives take the form of musical interludes. Either some character actually breaks into song. This happens all the time in both old and contemporary. I mean, Tolkien is an example of one who's like peppered with, suddenly we start singing, whether it's about like, we're performing at the Prancing Pony, and there was an inn, a merry old inn, or we're taking a bath and suddenly we're singing about water hot that smokes and steams, or whatever it is. So characters are breaking into song, and this is really working against that idea of the one quest and the one trajectory and the one character, the one purpose of the epic. In the ancient tradition, very often these musical interludes take the form of a lament. You have, in the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh weeping for Enkidu, his lost friend. And this, so along with this sort of world conquering, fighting impulse, you also have a real acknowledgement of the affective, the emotional cost of all of those wars. There's a lot of weeping. The interludes also often involve women, whether the women are voicing laments, or they might also be little romantic interludes where suddenly you go into a garden and there's a beautiful witch and the warrior is completely distracted from the quest. And so is the audience. And so clearly is everybody who, originally told this story, that, this almost takes on an energy and an interest that that sort of outweighs it becomes more exciting and interesting than the quest that we're supposed to be paying attention to. So you have almost it's like the opposite of the epic is encapsulated in the epic. And we see this in stories of wandering, meandering, knights errant, going off of the prescribed path. And I see an enormous amount of potential in this counter epic energy that is embedded inside the epic, which I think the great example of the counter epic taking over the epic would be the 1001 Nights, which is, this series of stories that is all digression, told by a woman in a bedroom, in a domestic space, and yet is absolutely epic in its sort of ambitions and its vastness and its effects. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much for speaking. That was a wonderful talk. We will, I guess, drift on from the world of epics and quests into the spookier shadows of the weird and the uncanny. So this section also has, all of the sections have 5 essays with 2 longer and 3 shorter. So the shorter essays in the weird and uncanny are won by our former student at the Centre for Fantastic, Lucinda Holdsworth, who writes about the devil in fantasy literature. We asked Chris Gardner, who is the narrative director for the interactive fiction Fallen London, which has been growing online for nearly 15 years at this point, building this amazing version of Victorian London that fell through the earth in 1862 and now exists in a strange cavern under the world, talking about the experience of what happens when you are a player of weird fiction rather than a reader and how that changes your behavior. You've got a chapter by China Miéville on weird non-realism. So the way that weirdness emerges into narratives in which it perhaps has no place being, but nevertheless comes through. So he's talking about more realist modes, including Jane Eyre, interesting, but also lots of fiction from the 60s and 70s, which I was unfamiliar with, but then really wanted to read after reading this essay. And then I wrote something about weird architectures in fantasy, and particularly the sort of love of the weird city that almost overwhelms the stories going on inside it. But for Spotlight today, we really wanted to ask VanderMeer to write about the weird as someone who is one of the sort of premier editors of weird stories, as editor of Weird Tales for a long time, edits for Tor and for a whole series of other magazines, including her own imprints. But also as a sort of someone who's really pushed back the borders of what we consider as the weird, particularly in her anthologizing work. So there can be a very narrow definition of the weird that is sort of Macklin and Lovecraft and a particular group of early 20th century authors. And Anne has shown us how much deeper the strange roots of the weird go and how much more cross-cultural it is as a tradition. So we asked her to write about that, and she obliged with a wonderful essay she's going to talk about.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. And also thank you to all of you for contributing to this beautiful book. And I'm so honored to be a part of this and to be here today with all of you talking about the things that I love so much, stories. I just love stories. I wanted to start off by letting you know that I don't come from an academic background, just so you all know that. I come first as a voracious reader and then later as a publisher and editor. I began my adventure in weird fiction back in my childhood when I started reading the L. Frank Baum Oz books. And when I talk about the Oz books, I'm not just talking about the Wizard of Oz that everyone knows about, but I'm talking about all the other books in his series. They were really weird. If you go back and you look at them now, they were really weird. But this was my introduction that started my love affair with weird fiction. And I didn't know it had a name then. I just knew that I loved it. And it caused me to seek out these types of stories throughout my life. But people seem to want a definition when we talk about weird fiction, or really any type of fiction. So let me start with this. A weird tale, as defined by H.P. Lovecraft, is a story that has a supernatural element, but does not fall into the category of a traditional ghost story or Gothic tale. As Lovecraft wrote in 1927, the weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains. Instead, it represents the pursuit of some indefinable and perhaps maddeningly unreachable understanding of the world beyond the mundane, a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread, or malign and particular suspension or defeat of fixed laws of nature. Through fiction that comes from the more unsettling, shadowy side of the fantastical tradition, beauty and fascination are as wedded in these stories as are horror and fear of the unknown. In addition, the weird is a more precise label for certain types of supernatural fiction, and also fiction allied with the supernatural that may achieve the same effect without a supernatural element. Although the weird may at times be identified by feel, that a certain type of feel can be quantified even as it remains elusive. This slippery quality may frustrate academics, but it also helps explain why weird fiction remains difficult to commercialize or commodify. The slippery quality allows it to shift, and it also allows it to be relevant in every generation and across all cultures and languages. And I also just want to take a moment to say how much I appreciate Cristina and Sofia talking about the worldwide aspects of fantastical literature instead of keeping it in this little, Euro-American centric box. I love that. When Jeff and I were putting together the Weird Anthology, I was struck by how many different writers from around the world were creating and publishing incredible weird fiction, and for the most part, without having any knowledge of each other. I did find, however, one possible common thread with the popularity of Edgar Allan Poe. Not only was much of his work translated into various languages, some of those translators went on to write their own weird fiction, quite different though, such as Jorge Luis Borges. But largely, these writers were unaware of what was being written and published in other countries. I found that to be quite fascinating, taking a look at the stories that they were writing at the same time period without knowing about each other. It's important to include works in translation. Given that the weird relies on feel to some extent, style in translation affects the effect of certain stories unduly. Having the right translation that conveys the atmosphere of the story and the author's intent was vital. And for that reason, we commissioned several new translations of stories that had already been translated back in the 50s and 60s. At roughly the same time that Lovecraft was writing tales like the Dunwich Horror and the Call of Cthulhu, Jean Rey, in a Belgian prison, wrote stunning and sophisticated stories like The Shadowy Street. Japanese poet Sakutaro composed the hallucinogenic strangeness that is the town of cats, and Polish writer Bruno Schulz mythologized his childhood in weird stories like Sanatorium at the Sign of the Hourglass. These non-Anglo versions of the weird were not aberrations, and some of our discoveries were astonishing. In the 1910s, Japanese writer Akutagawa published The Hell Scream, and Franz Kafka, still to remain relatively unknown for decades, wrote the classic story In the Penal Colony. While in India, the writer Tagore wrote his most supernatural tale, The Hungry Stones, and in Italy, Luigi Ugolini penned The Vegetable Man, a tale of weird transformation. William Hope Hodgson's novel, The House on the Borderland, published in 1908, had a profound influence on the classic weird tale. These writers came from vastly different backgrounds, but were bound together by some common impulse in their imaginations, some need to make sense of the fearful and fascinating mystery that is life in a particular way. And during my research, I sadly discovered that for their efforts, a disproportionate number of them died in poverty and were marginalized as outsider artists or hacks, with the strangest but oftentimes most imaginative stories ignored or misunderstood, even within the already cast-out genre of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Some were shot or sent to death camps during times of war. Too many committed suicide, sometimes driven there by an impulse closely tied to the unique nature of their creativity. A lucky few gained popularity and a wide readership for their efforts. What all of these writers and the writers who would come after them shared was some element of the visionary in their writing, some impulse or worldview that catapulted them beyond the everyday. The weird acknowledges that our search for understanding about worlds beyond our own cannot always be found in science or religion, and thus it becomes an alternative path for exploration of the unknown. The weird tale represents a clear quest not just to understand the inexplicable. It represents a fascination that at times embraces the inexplicable, and in many cases avoiding the terror of such a search. Many of these stories hold up to repeated readings for this reason. These weird tales are universal and timeless, crossing boundaries, both real and imagined. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So we have one more section to go. I see we have some questions being added to that. Do feel free to add questions if you have things you'd like to ask any of our speakers or our speakers as a panel. So our final section is Portals and Worlds. So the shorter essays in the section include Tanya's own essay on the Bronte's Juvenilia, The Worlds of Glasstown and Angria, which are displayed quite prominently in the exhibition. We've got quite a lot of Bronte material, which we're very keen to include, including the maps. Our other colleague on the exhibition, Sofia Gosling's essay on true names and world building, the development of the sort of the name that changes the world. We've got Wendy Froud talking about creating the dark crystal, along with Brian Froud, again connecting with those costumes in the exhibition. We have an essay by Laurie Penny thinking about fan culture and the experience of being in fandom and the sort of the delights and sometimes the disappointments of the process of growing very close to a world and then seeing it change or seeing its moment pass on. And then finally, we have my colleague and co-director for the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, Professor Dimitra Fimi, who has written amazingly about portals, and we knew that she'd done this already, so we asked her to revisit some of her work on children's literature and to do some new explorations of the wonderful ability to move between fantasy worlds and for those portals to become complicated modes of transition. So, Dimitra.
Great, thank you very much, Matt and Tanya. I'd like to also say one more time, it's been an amazing experience to be part of this book, and it was, you know, I write on fantasy as a scholar a lot, but that was a different kind of writing. I think I was trying to think a bit wider than that, but also it was a chance to think about some questions that I've had in the back of my mind for a very long time. So the remit for me was try to bring together the general, the more general themes of this section of world building with particularly portal fantasies, but also children's literature and children's fantasy, which is one of the areas I work on. So I started thinking, first of all, about this whole idea of the fantasy world. And this is where, this is the beauty of this book. This is where a lot of what I'm going to say now really dovetails quite nicely with what everybody else has said so far in terms of boundaries and crossing worlds and sort of making sense of the world via creating another world, etc. So my first thinking, I suppose, was to try and think about the fantasy world not just as a place or as a space, but as a more holistic experience, and trying to think around that. And also going back to these huge debates about the long versus the short history of fantasy. Where does it start? Is it this very ancient thing that goes back to mythological traditions, or is it a more sort of recent thing? I don't think there is a clear answer there, or there ever will be. I think it's always going to be something in between. But I was thinking also about how other worlds or alternative worlds have existed for a very long time in mythological traditions. And I was thinking, aren't the islands that Odysseus sort of visits in the Odyssey different worlds, each of them? Or what about the sort of the other world over the sea or underground in the Irish medieval tradition, etc. So what about, we talked about some knights errant as well. What about the forest in medieval romances? Or what about utopias, thinking about some of the more political aspects potentially of the fantastic, and of trying to think about how the world could be governed differently, potentially, or structured differently. And then I suppose I was also trying to sort of work in a number of quite common subcategories of fantasy worlds and sort of definitions, but without going down the route of sort of enumerating all the different clashing definitions that are out there that we tend to do with my students. So I ended up sort of categorizing or dividing fantasy worlds into four broader categories. There is what some scholars call intrusion fantasy, other people call low fantasy, in which there is no other world. The other world is our world, but is being changed, transformed, sort of intruded by magical creatures or mythological beings, something that comes from the past, something that comes from the future. Or, suddenly we realize that there's tiny recesses of our world where other little worlds exist as well. Thinking about Mary Norton's The Borrowers, which is something I'm working on at the moment. And then sort of moving on to what some scholars call high fantasy, other scholars immersive fantasy or secondary world fantasy, in which we have this idea of the completely other alternative world, which most definitions will talk about as self-contained or as sort of completely independent from our world. And this is one of the ideas I really wanted to sort of interrogate, because if you start scratching the surface, you soon realize that none of these alternative worlds are completely independent or completely separated from our world. Sometimes the authors themselves sort of want to forge a link with the world. And again, bringing Tolkien up, he had this whole sort of conceit about Middle Earth as a sort of as an imaginary past, a mythical sort of proto-prehistory, or the ways in which, for example, and this is where I wanted to bring in picture books as well. That's a bee in my bonnet at the moment, that we forget picture books for very young children as part of the fantasy tradition or as part of sort of fantasy narratives. How Tove Janssen's Moomin books seem like a completely other world, completely strange, quite weird actually at times, so fitting quite nicely with a weird tradition there as well. And self-contained until it gets to that last picture book, or towards the end of the writing of this series, the picture book called The Dangerous Journey, in which we have a girl from our world suddenly transported into Moomin Valley. So there is a link, there is this desire to go there, which I think is fascinating. Then I moved into a category that most people don't call anything, but I think it's a separate thing, and I called it overlay worlds. And this is where the alternative world sits atop ours, and there are sort of physical contact points, and you just need to know where to go, or be at the right place at the right time, or know the sort of mechanism to access it. So I was thinking there about Neverwhere, which is the London above and the London below, and these moments where the two Londons touch. And the map in this novel is, of course, the underground map of London. Or Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, which is the early version of the Peter Pan story, in which Neverland is in Kensington Gardens. You just need to know when to be at the right place, etc., etc. And eventually that leads me on to what I was asked to write about initially, which is portal fantasy. And one of the big questions I really wanted to ask there is, what makes a good portal? What do we expect from a portal? And I was thinking about framings. I was thinking about going through sort of windows or doors, or sort of paintings or mirrors, or going down rabbit holes, something where, the body physically goes through a particular sort of frame or barrier, but also possibly wearing a hat or wearing a ring, or something where a small part of the body goes through, all the way to wonderful Wizard of Oz, where there seems to be a sort of violent movement in space-time. So thinking about portals there as well, I was also thinking about that crossing, right? So we expect in a lot of these fantasy worlds, we expect a one-way ticket. We expect either the character to go through and have an experience and come back if it's portal fantasy, or we expect everything to happen in some other place with no link with our world. And that's where, in the last sort of part of the essay, I really wanted to explore a particularly innovative and interesting example of turning everything upside down, which is Diane Wynne-Jones' Howl's Moving Castle. So those of you who know it, I won't spoil it too much, hopefully. We start in a fairy tale world. Again, fits quite nicely with what we were discussing before. It's a generic fairy tale world. We know there's magic there. We know, you accept some things as existing. And there is a castle, which is a portal, and different doors of the castle take you in different places within that world. And that's fine. You're thinking, okay, this is fantasy. We're going to have portals. That's all right. Until a particular side of the castle takes the characters from this fairy tale world into something that feels like our world. There is tarmac on the streets, and there's clearly a box, that is a television. And people wear jeans, or our main protagonist that doesn't even know what to call that because it's not part of their world. It's a different experience, and it becomes even more strange when we realize that it's actually the real world place is actually Wales, which is a very particular choice. It's a country in the margins of the sort of Anglophone world, with its own language, with its own tradition, with its own mythological past, with dragons and castles, all of that sort of fantasy paraphernalia. But at the same time, we're not taken to the romanticized sort of medieval Wales. We're taken to the South Wales valleys, where there's like pockets of social deprivation, where rugby culture is sort of the big thing. And Diana Wynne-Jones, I think, is sort of playing that very ironic and very knowing game of giving us Wales as an imaginary world, but at the same time reminding us that, imaginary worlds aren't as romantic or as lovely as we might think, or as enchanting as we might think. There are issues there as well, and there are real world issues there as well. And again, I won't go too much into all of this. There's a lot more in the essay on that. But I suppose where I want to sort of end with all of this is what constitutes the otherness of the other world. And at the end of the day, what does constitute the otherness of the other world is this expectation of the alien, the strange, and the unfamiliar. But sometimes we have to realize that the alien, the strange, and the unfamiliar is actually our world, and it's the perception that changes and makes everything different. There we go. Thank you.
Very much. So that's some details on 4 of the essays in the book. There are 16 more you can go and find. There's also a preface by a jobbing writer called Neil Gaiman, who you may have come across, who very kindly introduced the book for us. And there are a series of other people we should thank who are really instrumental in the creation of the book. So Sveta Dorosheva, who did the amazing key art for the exhibition as a whole, both allowed us to use that key art throughout the book and also did versions of it, introducing each essay. So they all have these lovely splash title pages, which with little elements of the things that appear in the essays incorporated. So those are very beautiful in themselves. We should also thank our colleagues at British Library Publishing. So Sally Nichols did a lot of the picture research, as I said at the beginning. Some of the images in the book relate directly to the things that are in the exhibition, but a lot of them don't. And she did amazing work finding a whole series of other images to match each of the essays correctly. Oki Murray did the sort of the layout for the book, which we made be adjusted at a number of points, which I feel slightly guilty, but it has come out really nicely. So I think those tweaks were worthwhile. And Johnny Davidson really did the job of holding everything together at the production stage. There were a number of other colleagues who were involved in the book throughout, were all credited, but Johnny was the person when everything came in who had to assemble it all and marshal it all. She did with admirable calm and under some very tight deadlines. And so he really deserves a lot of credit for how well I think things have turned out.
Can I also just say there was one version of the proofs where Matt and I both went through them individually, and I think I found like 6 things and Matt found 98 things. So I was immensely grateful for someone who has more of an eye for detail than I do.
One of the people I co-supervise with just refers to me as the pedant, which I think it is. Yeah, I do have one of those minds who likes certain things to be neat. So, and they can apply that in a non-disruptive way when doing anything. We were going to take some more general questions, but we've already got a whole series of questions flowing into the Q&A. So shall we just take questions from people here? Please do continue to add questions to the Q&A. We can come back to some more general questions later on. But if you have questions, add them to the Q&A. Tanya, should we start pulling questions out? Some of them are for specific people, but I think they can also be addressed to the panel more broadly.
Shall we maybe do, there's one very general one. Shall we maybe start with that and then go into the more specific one? So the general one is, how do the panel feel our relationship with fantasy and stories will change, or if it will, in an increasingly challenging world, e.g. post-COVID or with climate change? I think our relationship with fantasy has a lot to do with our relationship with the natural world. I'd be interested to know if the panel thinks those are linked and in what ways. Thanks. Shall we? Go on, go for it.
I have a thought, because this is related to a kind of aha moment that I had while I was reading some of the essays. And it was actually Matt's essay on weird architecture together with Dimitra's essay that caused me to have this moment. Because when I was reading Matt's essay, you write about the uncanny, and related to, okay, it's Freud's unheimlich, and that means unhomely. Fine, these are all things that I have heard and indeed taught many times before, but it never struck me before that what gets lost in the translation from unheimlich or unhomely to uncanny is actually space. It's a sense of space. We're going from a word that designates a home or an unhome, a space, into something that's more about the unknown. And then I read Dimitra's essay, which is all about space. It's about, it's crossing borders. It's alternate spaces. And it struck me that so often when I read about realist novels, people are talking about time, the novel and time. How did the novel manage time? What is with Joyce and time? What is with Faulkner and time? But these stories that we're talking about seem to be so focused on space in a very specific way. And when I realized that, I thought to myself, there has to be then some connection to ecology here. There has to be something, if we're talking about a genre that is actually very, very good at talking about space and seems to have had this capacity all along for imagining space and relationships between spaces, then there must be some potential there for a real kind of a genre that really engages with the material world and with ecology. So I'll stop there. But that was a moment for me as I was reading these essays.
Oh, that's really lovely, Sophia. Can I go next? Yeah. So one of the things in my essay that I didn't manage to talk about, well, I was trying to sort of summarize far too quickly, but it's how different ways of world building emphasize different aspects of the experience of the world, right? And one of those is, which is becoming, I think, more and more important, is this reimagining our relationship with the natural world in particular. And of course, Tolkien's Ents is, a pretty obvious example, but the one I focused a bit more in the essay is Philip Pullman's the Mulefa, who are sort of they're sort of like elephants, but they've gone through a different evolution, an imaginary evolutionary process, and the way that they've evolved is actually in a symbiotic relationship with the trees that dominate the landscape, and sort of their survival also ensures the tree's survival. And I think that's the sort of thing that fantasy does really, really well. It sort of forces us to imagine a different evolutionary route potentially, or how non-anthropomorphic beings, which are sentient as well, might have this very complex community or communication system or empathy, and imagine completely out of our experience of how the natural world might be, but by building on the imaginary, on the natural world as we know it.
May I?
Yeah.
So I think great question and great answers. I think Wonder Tales are really important for us to think with in relating to what we call the natural world, right? And I think it's Ursula Le Guin who makes the point that we start talking about it as nature and the natural world when we're distant from it, when we've distanced ourselves from it as human beings. So in fairy tales, but especially in wonder tales, all kinds of wonder tales across the world, a all beings are sentient, and the relationships between human beings and non-human animals are, important. We find allies in animals and plants, and we also, of course, find opponents there as well, right? But that story is not all about conflicts. So in fairy tales, we can say that plants, in a way, have agency, because they can be poisonous or they can be healing, right? And yes, we have the dragon in fairy tales, like the opponent, but we have so many other animals that work with human beings to bring back some balance into the world. So, and in fairy tales, this is wondrous and magical. In other wonder tales across the world, it's part of belief that this is how the world, our planet, works. And when I say our, I don't mean that as a possessive, but one where we are part of this world.
I just wanted to say a couple things about this. First of all, at the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, I heard from a lot of writers saying, what is the point of me even writing now? This is stupid, it's silly, what stories, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized that, yes, we were all in a very bad situation. The whole world was dealing with this emergency. And what did we do as human beings? What's the first thing that we did? We went to story. We all started searching for books, movies, games, whatever. We gravitated towards story. And that's what we wanted. We wanted the storytelling. And so that's what I would say to the writers. No, the work that you're doing is not frivolous. It's not stupid. It's not silly. It's meaningful. It's what people need. It's especially what we need now in a time of need. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that we are living in a very complicated time right now. I don't know if it's more complicated than it was in the past. I only know about my personal experience in the years that I've been living. And it seems like we have a lot of challenges. And I know that there are many people that are specialists in different areas of the world in conservation and energy, et cetera, et cetera. And these scientists and these specialists are telling us all these different things and we can't comprehend it. The best way for us to understand what's happening in our world is, again, I just want to say it, through stories. And so that's why when I see writers today writing about these issues in a certain way, but they're doing it in an imaginative, creative way, they're not hitting you over the head with it. They're not saying, take a look at this. They're doing it in a way where you read a story and you're coming in because you're compelled by the characters and the conflict and the plot and this and that and the other. And when you come out at the end of the story, you're completely transformed, but then it makes you think about those things. What is my relationship to the animals in my backyard? What is my relationship to the person on the other side of the world? All of those things come into play because when you read a story, you're compelled by that story, by that person's experience, and you get that relationship going. And that's the thing that moves us ahead. So the short answer to the question is yes, I do think people are going to be reading more fantasy fiction in the future because we have to have stories. That's my answer.
Just very briefly, I think one of the things we were thinking about when we were putting together the Weird Done Kitty section is how is this not just a Gothic section, which is why we've already done a Gothic exhibition. I think the Fantastic Weird goes in two directions that are slightly different. One is like making things which insists are completely incomprehensible, that we cannot sort of fully understand, that we need to sort of respect the otherness of in their full otherness, even if those things have no care for us as in the Lovecraft's beings. But the other thing I think that fantasy often does when it gets hold of something that might be considered Gothic is try and understand the monsters or the creatures who are originally presented, make them more sympathetic. It's amazing how much vampires have transformed over their long history. And I think you could look at this in the microcosm within Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They begin as villains, they become part of the world and part of the company and those sorts of things. And I think fantasy often does that. Christina mentioned dragons, but they're the sort of antagonists of older stories, but in like modern fantasies. So in Robin Hobb, for example, there's these amazing kind of symbiotic relationships discussed, and like the situation with dragons at the beginning of stories is entirely because humans have unknowingly interfered with their life cycles, and there's quite a lot of exciting reparative work done within that story to try and sort of come to a kind of reapproachment or forming of a new sort of relationship. So I think fantasy, because it sort of has this process where it returns to stories and thinks through them again, or when one person puts something down, that someone else who can move a bit further with it or can do something different that can pick it up again has a real potential for thinking through these evolving relationships and to getting us to places where we can express new kinds of empathy. It's not potential that always realized, but I think for me that's one of the really important promises that fantasy holds out.
Amazing. Those are all such great answers. I'm going to go for the first question, which is a question for Sophia. And it is, I love this idea of the everything book. Do you think an everything book has to be epic in length as well as scope? Would an everything novella be possible? Or is the physical size of the book itself part of the epicness?
My answer is, I hope so. I hope that an epic novella is possible. I love this question. This is actually a kind of dream or an aspiration of mine to imagine how to write something that feels epic, but is not actually, hundreds of pages. What and it's a really interesting question to think about, because what it looks at then is, what is it that that we're looking for as people who engage with these kind of narratives? What is it that we're looking for that is not just length? And I think the fact that we can even ask this question means that there is something there, that there is a sensibility, there is a feeling, maybe a feeling of expansion that is not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to read hundreds of pages to get it. So yeah, whoever asked that question and me, like we're both trying this. We're both trying this project, and, let me know how it goes, because I do think that, even possibly through fragments. I mean, a fragment only exists because it's a piece of something larger. So could you have, for example, a collection of fragments that would if each fragment is suggesting some large whole, that could, within a small amount of space, give you a feeling of something huge. So I don't know. I think it's possible, and I hope so.
I wonder whether we could turn this question to Anne, who probably knows, or almost certainly knows, short fiction better than the rest of us on this call as an editor. The book that springs first to mind for me is Niveau's Empress of Salt and Fortune, which I think pulls something of that trick of conjuring an entire world in a very short book through this sort of series of conversations and allusions out that's very tight focus on objects. And I was wondering whether you could think of any sort of shorter forms where you get that sense the whole world is conjured in a tiny space. We can return to this if I've just sprung something on you. Yeah, I think it's definitely one that would be nice to continue thinking about. Should we take another question? We can return to this issue of the everything novella or the everything story. I guess it's also the Aleph, isn't it? It's like that's the Borges dream, the sort of single character, the single thing that somehow encompasses everything else.
That's a great example, actually. That's a great example of just this.
Sophia, do you want to answer the question about extended universes in current multimedia franchises? In fact, this is another question that several people could answer. Any thoughts on the popularity of those at the moment?
Okay, yes, I'm looking for the question.
So it's at the
Can
top.
can you just read the question?
Yeah, sure. A lot of what, Sophia, a lot of what you said about epics made me think about current multimedia franchises and extended universes. Do you have any thoughts on the popularity of these at the moment?
Yeah, I think that really, you know, this if we talk about and I write about this a bit in the essay, you know, these big franchises and also games, especially in role-playing games, there is a sense in which this is really kind of this is the ancient epic alive today, more so than written literature, because it is especially when you have people who are involved in, you know, playing different roles. There's a performance aspect to it, and there's a shared creation of worlds, which of course, you know, our oldest epics were oral, and so they were always being retold, and people would have their own take on it and take characters and do a spin-off and make a, you know, like, I'm going to take this guy Aeneas, who was kind of like a nobody in the whole Troy story, and then I'm going to pop him over here and make him the hero of a whole new epic. And this, you know, this happens time and again. And so I think that those living experiences of fantasy and the fantastic that you have within fan cultures that are alive and are happening kind of in real time, that's, you know, that's really the ancient epic tradition, more so than a book that is written by an individual author and kind of sits on a shelf and is read by somebody sitting in their house alone.
Yeah, it's the same thing as, like, I mean, you might not have seen every film in the Marvel universe or whatever, but you'll see a few of them. And that's kind of like the experience that we have with the Homeric epics today, right? Where you've only got the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is two random installments of a massive cycle.
Or the Arthurian legend, which
Yeah.
is continuations and different versions and like all different languages as well and different media. I was also thinking, sorry, just since I intervened, about because I was thinking back to what Anne said about Frank Baum's Oz, which is very weird indeed, the whole series of books. But that was a multimedia affair right from the beginning. There was a play and a musical and merchandise. He knew what he was doing. He was very good.
And a cartoon strip,
as a businessman, yeah.
And a magic lantern show, which I was
Everything.
made to edit out of the label because Susan Diamond, who was our interpretation manager on the exhibition, said no one will know what a magic lantern show is. I was like, So it's become
there's
a
long
slideshow.
tradition of this. Yeah, sure.
And with Wonder Tales and fairy tales, I mean, they've been multimedia forever.
Yeah.
Really, across cultures, you know, whether it's with puppets or whether it's dance or theater, and of course storytelling, oral storytelling, and now of course movies and games as well. It strikes me, listening to all of you, that with fairy tales, when you think multimedially today, often there's a kind of effort to expand the fairy tale and expand its world, right? Whether it's the prequel or the sequel or a different protagonist, right? We get a multiplication, really, of the story, an expansion of the story. And that's, except I guess with live action Disney movies, you don't really get that. But
Interestingly enough, last night I finished reading the autobiography of Geddy Lee, who was the lead singer of Rush. And I didn't know a whole lot about, I didn't know all the details of the 40-year career of Rush, the band. But I discovered that a lot of their music was inspired by fantasy fiction, and a lot of the concept albums they did was surrounded all about that, because their drummer was a voracious reader, and most of the work that he read was fantasy fiction. And he brought that into the studio when the three of them would come together and write their music. So I was totally fascinated with the very specific ways in which they told stories through their albums and then through their touring, the shows that they would put on. So when we talk about multimedia, I mean, here was someone who was inspired by fantasy fiction, writing these not really rock operas, but these concept albums, and then putting on these great shows and traveling all around the world with them. And so they were bringing their concept and their perspective of what fantasy fiction is. They even had a steampunk show, which I did not know. I mean, I didn't know any of these things, but I was completely blown away by this book. And it's just an autobiography, but it's amazing how much I find all these links to fantasy fiction in everything that I read that's not even fantasy. This was an autobiography, a nonfiction book.
I think that's one of the things that one of the experiences we've had of hearing people who visited the exhibition, and a lot of people have said, oh, I didn't think I really read or liked fantasy, but actually seeing all of these things has really made me reappreciate them and see how kind of ubiquitous and inspirational it's been to loads of other forms of storytelling. It's kind of made people reassess what they thought about the genre and come up with their own new ideas about it, which has been really great. I'm going to go for the question about portal fantasy being inherently escapist, but I want to kind of broaden it out a bit. So the question is, do you think portal fantasy is inherently escapist? I think it certainly lends itself to escapism, and that's how it's typically written. And I think one of the things that we grappled with this exhibition is this idea that fantasy is all escapist, which is something that we kind of came across when we were initially talking to people about the fact that we were doing this exhibition. They were like, oh, people really need it at the moment just because it lets you escape into another world, and things are hard, and this is very important. But we really wanted to get across the fact that it's more than that. It does more things than just that. So I'm going to start with Dimitra and let you start off with saying what you think.
Sure. Gosh, that's a very old debate.
Yeah.
In the scholarship, isn't it? It really depends on how you define escape and what escape means, right? There is one way of understanding escape, which is I'm going to ignore what's happening around me and go somewhere on my own and sort of not face things. And then there's the escape, how does Tolkien say it? It's the escape of the prisoner, right? If you're a prisoner, you want to escape, and it's a good thing. Escape it's not deserting, it's sort of escaping. There are a number of things here to be said. As a children's fantasy specialist, there is a big debate, for example, about what do you do with the child protagonist when they've returned from the other world, from when they have gone there, they have learned something, they have often saved the world, often done, have acquired agency in a way that they wouldn't have had in the adult world where they return. What do you do with them afterwards? And obviously, for a long time, the children come from Narnia, and the children, they're not kings and queens anymore. Their agency is sort of taken away from them. Or in other cases, authors felt so conflicted about what to do that they have the children forget what they learned or what they went through in the other world. And I think what I'm seeing more of now, which is making things much more interesting, is actually that retainment of the child protagonist's agency, that they come back and they actually have changed, and they could maybe affect change in their own world. And that's the opposite of escapism in many ways. Yeah. And then again, in my piece, I talk a lot about how by creating other worlds, we're really confronting problems, issues, anxieties, worries, about our own world, and sort of looking at it sideways, or maybe from a slightly different perspective. But it's the same stuff that we are dealing with, and we're treating. So it's a huge question. It's very difficult to sort of answer, but hopefully I've started answering it. But I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel.
I want to turn it over to Cristina next, I think, because I'd love to hear what you think about how fairy tales deal with escapism.
It's a great question. And I see in the chat someone saying, what's wrong with escapism anyway? And that would be kind of actually the beginning of my answer, because I think fairy tales do take us into another world. But they do so that we can return with resources with a sense of how things can be different. And in fairy tales, our fairy tales are filled with injustice, with horror, children who are hungry, the threat of being eaten, right? Women who are persecuted, smaller beings, basically, who are taken advantage of. There's no escaping the horrors of the everyday world in fairy tales, but all of these are presented in order to be undone. And so I think facing not only our fears, but the realities of this world is important, just as is the sense that we can make a difference, we can change things, that there's a future that we can build. And that's, I think, part of the fairy tale world.
I wanted to say as well that I think it is one of the things that human beings use stories for, is to step aside from the situation that I'm in and look at maybe an analogy or, you know, some other situation that was similar but is not actually my reality. And that's where I do the thinking and the processing that then allows me to turn to my own situation and say, okay, you know, here's what I'm going to do, because maybe I'm stuck in my situation. If I can fling in a story from the Bible, when after King David has, you know, been evil and bad and had Uriah killed, God sends him a prophet who tells him a story and says, well, there was a rich man and there was a poor man, and the rich man had everything and the poor man only had one little lamb, and the rich man took his lamb away. And King David says, that's horrible. Well, where is this guy? I'm going to have him, you know, I'm going to have him punished. And the prophet in Nathan says to him, you are the man. So it's by, you know, you don't see what you're doing in the situation you're in. You get a story, you go into a storytelling space about it, then it's not you, it's at a remove. And then that can be a moment of kind of intellectual wrestling with your experience, but in this other space that you can then recognize things that you want to change in the real space.
Do you want to come in, Anne?
I also want to say, what's wrong with escapism? There's nothing wrong with that. Because as soon as I saw that comment, it's like, yes. But to me, when I'm reading speculative fiction, fantasy fiction, what have you, I don't really consider it to be escapist, even though you are actually thrown into a completely different world. The way I look at it is, when you're reading these types of stories, it really transforms you when you come to the end. So what it does allow you to do, like Sofia was saying, is that it allows you to have a different perspective when you come out the other end of the story. So when I think about escapism and escapist stories, for me, my guilty pleasure is detective novels. So I read a lot of detective novels, especially works in translation, because that really takes me to another country. And I read them and I'm not really transformed when I'm finished, but it's enjoyable. So to me, when I think of escapism for reading, it's detective novels. It's not fantasy. Fantasy to me makes me work. Not in a hard way, but in a pleasurable way. You know, it makes me work. It makes me think about things. And so those people that say, oh, it's just this, like I said, you know, it's frivolous or whatever, they haven't really read fantasy fiction. They just really haven't given it a try. But those detective novels, let me tell you something, you will escape with them.
We take this last question for Sofia. We've got a couple of questions about the US tour, and Tanya, I can answer those insofar as we're able. But Phil Rodriguez has a question for Sofia, just asking her to say a little bit more about the potential of counter-epic digressions and stories, either ancient or modern, that you think embrace this aesthetic particularly effectively.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will mention a writer or a writer collective, I could say, maybe, that I am very obsessed with at the moment, and have been for a little while. And this is Antoine Volodine, who writes in French, but many books have been translated into English. And Antoine Volodine is a pseudonym, but this same person writes under several other names as well. He writes under the name Lutz Bassmann. He writes under the name Manuela Dreger, and has written, I think he's approaching 40 books that are in this sort of post-apocalyptic, fantastical space. And this work seems to me, it is incredibly digressive, because what these other names are, like the names of Manuela Dreger and Lutz Bassmann, these are writers who appear in works written by Antoine Volodine. In other words, they are characters from the narrative that have now come out and are writing books under their own names. So when you have this happening, it completely breaks down this idea of a single author, of a single narrative. Yes, they are loosely related and characters are going in and out of these different books. But it's also, it's incredibly digressive. There are different genres being written. Like Manuela Dreger is like the children's book writer from inside this world. So she's writing these, fantasies for children, but in this with these very kind of dystopian images. And we know that she's, in prison and in a terrible space. I mean, it's a really incredible series of books. I think all told, there are maybe 8 or so that have been translated into English by different publishers. If you see the writer known as Antoine Volodine giving an interview, when he's asked questions, he answers we, like he uses first person plural to talk about this collective of writers.
Amazing.
It's wild. And I highly recommend these books. And I think, if you ask me to say, where's the anti-epic epic, where's the digressive epic, what's the potential of that, I would say read those books.
Well, that's really interesting. I guess there's sort of something of the kind of fan fictional playing out of all the alternative possibilities, although it also leads us into the garden of forking paths to continue our sort of Borges describing all the shapes of fantasy. Can I just ask one final question of the panel? I'm finally going to get to we already actually have this question in the chat. I was preempted. We have a question asking for recommended reading, and so I would also like to ask that question. Are there any works of fantasy that you've read recently, or not particularly recently, that you would really recommend? I think one of the things that comes out if you read the whole book is there are a whole series of wonderful recommendations, so it can give you a long reading list. But it would be great if people just have one or two things that they would say. I have just read Frances Hardinge's Deep Light, and I am so regretful that I've not read Frances Hardinge before, and so excited that I have other Frances Hardinge novels to read. So Deep Light, which is about a group of islands called the Myriad and the terrible vast undersea gods that have grown in the sea under the sea previously, and they escaped from their dominion in various ways. So just incredible. Does anyone else have things that they would like to recommend?
I'm just reading Kelly Link's White Cat, Black Dog, and it's a great collection of retellings of fairy tales. And but I do want to make a plug for this graphic novel, The Magic Fish, which is just wonderful. This Vietnamese American author, illustrator, is just fantastic. And this book as well, this is a picture book, and it begins once upon a time, so I will call it a kind of a fairy tale, but it is just remarkable. So I'm not going to say anything about them other than enjoy if you read them.
So great. And did you? So,
Yes, I wanted to talk about this book that actually came out in 2019, but I didn't read it until last year, and I don't think a lot of people have heard of it. It's called The Spectral Hue by Craig Lawrence Gidney, and it's a very short novel, but it's one of the most amazing books that I have read in the past couple of years, and I keep recommending it to people because even though I read it last year, I still can't stop thinking about it. It's called The Spectral Hue by Craig Lawrence Gidney, and it came out in 2019.
I wanted to plug a children's fantasy book because that's what I'm doing at the moment, and that is I'll just put in.
You've muted Dimitra, I think.
Oh, I'm muted. There you go.
No, we heard the beginning. You just then muted at the end.
I wanted to plug a children's fantasy book, and that I've just put the link on the chat. It's SF Said's Tiger, which is a story set in an alternative London in which slavery was never abolished. So it's sort of an alternative history. It's sort of Victorian London in a much worse situation than it was. And then this young boy, Adam, who is from a non sort of white background and family, finds that magical mystical creature, the tiger. And there's elements of Narnia there, and there's elements of William Blake. Tiger is spelled with a Y. And there's lots of magic and lots of empowerment and agency and lots of amazing things happening. So it's just won lots of awards here in the UK, which I was totally expecting. I was very lucky to get a preview of the book, and I think it's one of those that'll become a modern classic, really.
I know I just said read all Antoine Valentin, but if I can plug one more, it would be Renee Gladman's Ravika series, set in this strange world of Ravika. The first book is called Event Factory, and these are very small books, and I would say they do have an epic feel. The main character of Event Factory is a linguist who goes to Ravika, and in Ravika, language it requires a combination of speech and gesture. So you're using your whole body to speak, and if you say the word but you don't use the right gesture, you've said a completely different word and completely different meaning. So they're very the books are very interested in language, and they're just fascinating and really beautifully written as well.
I would like to plug T. Kingfisher. So talking about fantasy escapism, so this is the first exhibition I've worked on that hasn't completely killed the genre for me temporarily. I did a Shakespeare exhibition a while back, and after that I was like, I cannot watch any Shakespeare ever. But with fantasy, I'm more into it than ever, which is a great sign. But I really love her world building in the books. She's just got a new one that came out a couple of weeks ago in the Paladin series that is a kind of amazing, they're kind of cozy fantasy, but they also have a kind of a great thread of like people kind of sorting things out in a very cathartic way. I enjoy them very much, so I'd like to plug her.
I'm trying to think what we can say about the touring exhibition. I think the first destination has been announced. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, the exhibition is going on tour. We are hoping for at least 3 venues. It's like they're likely to be in North America. We've got 1 venue in California pretty much confirmed. Can't announce where it is yet, sorry. That will be in autumn 24 to spring 25. Then we've got 1 hopefully in a southern state, and then we're looking for an East Coast venue for the 3rd venue. So if you know of any East Coast venues that you would love to have the fantasy exhibition visit, I would love it to take it to NYC, then let us know.
Yes, possibly further from that. What will go on tour will not be everything in the current exhibition, will also be some things that are not in the current exhibition. So it'll be a slightly revised version of the exhibition. So if you were following it around the world somehow, you can see it again, and there will be some new surprises.
It'll be a new version. Yeah, there's a few things that can't tour for conservation reasons, but I have to say we have got some really very exciting additions. So I'm excited about the tour.
And if you want to access the recording of this to go back through those recommendations, the recording will be on the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic YouTube channel immediately, I think, pretty much, because we're streaming live there. So you can just go visit the Centre's channel and revisit that and look for those recommendations. I think that brings us to the end of our time. Can I just thank all of our amazing speakers again for their wonderful talks and wonderful responses to questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
And can I also just thank the University of Glasgow, who've been like an amazing support on this exhibition, and without whom we could not have done it. So thank you to Matt, obviously as co-curator, but also Dimitra and all your colleagues who've been amazing.
It's been a great privilege, and our students absolutely loved getting involved with the whole process, and yeah, had some brilliant ideas.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Tanya. And thank you, everybody who was here for listening.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming along. And yeah, thanks to Brian and to Terry and to all of the other authors as well. We would have, if we could have done a full event with all 20 authors, but world locations and the limitations of time, maybe we could have done it in space, but time would have been the constraint there. But we made a book so that we did not have to do that event, and so go find all of the wonderful contributions there.
Right, I'm just going to close this now. This is my job now to close the streaming and the webinar. Thank you all very much. As Matt says, the recording should be up there in about 2 seconds. All right, thank you all.
So much.
Bye bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.